I've got the piston. I've just got some old engine oil. It's not old, it's a new bottle, but it's been sitting around for a while. I'm just gonna put a light coating of oil around these rings. You know, just enough so they'll slide through easy. Put some on the piston skirts. It doesn't have to be a lot. This is going to burn off anyway. I'll put a light coating of engine oil just around the inside of this compressor. Doesn't have to be much, just a little. I'm even going to put a light coat of oil just inside this cylinder. We've got everything set up. Now I'm going to compress this, and you can see that the piston just kind of fits in here. Move this around a little bit so you can see better. You want to put this over the piston. And there's a key that fits in here that I don't have anymore. But I'm just going to use a screwdriver to turn this. And I'll do it off camera. We've got the piston rings compressed. And we can see that we have the in here, so we want to make sure that in goes towards the intake side of the engine. So we're just going to lightly set this in here. And just make sure that you line it up, you know, as best you can. So we want this as straight as we can get it, so we don't have to move it too much in the cylinder once it's in there. And then to tap it in, we're just going to take, not the rubber end because it won't fit, but we will take the handle part and just tap this in lightly. And you don't want to force this in. If it doesn't go in, figure out why it's not working correctly, because you can mess up the cylinder or the piston or the rings by forcing things. So, and that actually went in very easy. So you can see we have the piston in, and you want to push it so it's just below the top of the cylinder bore, and then check again to make sure you've got the in towards the intake. And we've got 3 more to do. I'm going to do the same thing I did with this one. I'll just do it off camera, and I'll be back when I'm done with those. I've got all the pistons in, as you can see. What I'm going to do next is I'm going to flip this half. So this is just the top half of the engine case. I'm going to flip this over. We're going to set these pistons. We're going to set these 2 to bottom dead center and these outside 2 to top dead center. And then we're going to put some assembly lube on everything, and we're going to get the crankshaft put in. So I'm going to get this set up, and I'll be back for that. I flipped the engine case over with the pistons installed, and you can see I've got these 2 outside pistons down at top dead center, so they're flush with the top of the engine case, piston bores. These 2 I've pulled as far back as I want to pull them back in the engine bores. We're going to get the crankcase installed in here. So we have reinstalled all of the bearings, the crankcase bearings. Before we do anything else, we need to coat everything in some assembly lube. So I'm going to put assembly lube in on all of these bearing surfaces. I'll get you set up, I'll show you that, and we'll get that crankshaft installed. I'm about to put the crankshaft in, and I've got to put some assembly lube on all of these bearings. So we're going to go ahead and do that. Make sure you use something. You don't have to use assembly lube. I like using this, but please don't put these together dry. At least put a little oil on them. I've unwrapped the crankshaft, and we put assembly lube on the bearings already, and put assembly lube on all of these journals also before we set this in the engine. You can't use enough of this. It's gonna kind of mix in with the oil when the engine starts for the first time. Feel free to put as much on as you want. So I've got you set back up here, and I've got all of these connecting rods kind of pulled towards the front of the engine. And we're gonna get the crankshaft set into these connecting rods, and then we're gonna push it forward a little bit so we can set it down into these bearings. This gear side goes on this side of the engine, and this bearing goes to that side of the engine. So I want to make sure we've got it correct. I'm going to set this in and just kind of get it settled into those connecting rods, and then move it up a little and get it set down into the journals. So you can see now we've got it set into all the journals, and all of the connecting rods are where they're supposed to be. Now that we've got the crankshaft in place, the journals set down in the bearings, and all of the connecting rods here kind of where they're supposed to be, the next thing we want to do is take off, because we're going to have to put the caps on now, and we can't put the caps on with these plastic pieces that we put on there to protect these journals. So very carefully, without hitting the journal, you want to grab these and pull them off. I'm just going to pull these plastic pieces off. Now that we've got all of these plastic pieces off, we can kind of pull these up in place a little bit. We don't have to. We're going to go ahead and get these caps put on, and we'll put them back on in the place we took them off, and we marked them 1, 2, 3, 4, so we'll get those put back on that way. I have the number 1 connecting rod cap, so we're going to get that put on here. And if we were to flip the engine right side up, this would be the number 1 cylinder right here, and the number 1 piston. And make sure the bearing is still on there. I checked the bearing clearance. The bearing clearance is very good. But if you remember, and I know you couldn't see what I was talking about in the other video when we took these off, it has a little notch right here on the side. Not a notch, but almost like a little protrusion on the back of the spine of this cap. And that should point towards the left side, which is the gear side. So this side, this little protrusion on the spine should point towards the gear side of the engine. So we'll just make sure we put these back on the way we got them. I'm not sure it would really matter if you put them on backwards, but we're going to do it the way we took them off. And we're also going to put a little bit of assembly lube on. And we'll just set that down in there, like so. And we'll start just to manually screw these cap bolts on. Cap nuts, I'm sorry. Cap nuts. And these cap nuts we will tighten to 18 foot-pounds. So I've got these two on, if you can see them in there. So I've got the cap on and the 2 nuts on there, and we're gonna tighten these to 18 foot-pounds, or 25 Newton meters if you're working in Newton meters. So let me grab my torque wrench and we will get this tightened down. These are 10 millimeter nuts. I've got my 10 mil. I got the torque wrench set to 18 foot-pounds. So let's get these 2 tightened down. And we'll do the same for the rest. I'll probably do it off camera, but let's do these. Okay, so we've got those both to 18 foot-pounds. I'm going to go ahead and go off camera. I'm just going to put these next 3 caps on the same way I did this one. I put all the the connecting rod caps on, and they're all torqued down correctly. So we should be able to spin this, and the pistons should move very freely. There shouldn't be any real drag. And you can see that the pistons go up and down just fine. So I believe we're ready to continue on putting this engine back together. We're ready now to put in the transmission gears. Since we've got the crank, the pistons, and the connecting rod caps put on and torqued down, our next step is to put in the transmission gears, which are right here. So I'm going to get you set up and we'll do that. The first set of gears we're going to put in is the smaller set. I haven't taken these apart, so I know they're all on correctly. These are the exact same way I took them out. One thing I do want you to notice when you put these in, on this end where this bearing is, there is a hole here. And that hole lines up on this side with this pin. So we're going to want to make sure that we feel that set down on that pin. We'll go ahead and set this in. I'm going to rotate this around so it'll set straight on that pin. And you kind of heard it set in there. And then we want to make sure that we don't have this side too far out. So we don't want it out like this. We want it to make sure it's seated. So this side has the pin, and this side has a seat right here. So we want to make sure this is pushed up against that seat. So this gear is in place. The next set of gears is the larger gears. Very similarly on the other side of this. This one also has a hole that coincides with this pin on this side. There's also another part on here that we want to make sure we get put in place. There's two other alignment pieces that need to happen. One of them is this set clip. This set clip falls into this groove on this side of this bearing, and it also falls into this first groove right, or this second groove right here. So when we get that set in place, we're going to want to make sure that we get those put in place. And thirdly, on this same bearing, you can see there is a small pin right here. This pin needs to be rotated around to the back of the engine, and it will sit right in this little groove right here. So three things. There's a pin on this side, the pin needs to sit in this groove here, and the set clip. So I'm going to get you set up and we'll do that. So I'm going to go ahead and set this. I'm going to try to get this, you may have to wiggle it around a little, but I'm going to go ahead and try to get this pin on this side first, because it's sometimes one of the harder parts to get done. And none of this is very hard. Okay, so you feel that set in there. Now this seal has a groove. Also, let me move you over here. This is a seal, and this seal also has a groove. And this seal groove fits into this groove in the engine case. So if that's in that groove, then this is lined up. And you can see that this slot and the slot in this engine case are not lined up correctly, so that the set clip will not line up correctly. So all we need to do for that is kind of push the gear over a little, and you can see it's lined up now. And then we want to make sure that this pin is pushed down into that groove. So we've got all three things. Pin here. The seal is in the groove. This pin is in the slot, and now we've got this lined up. So we can put the set clip on there. And what I want to do, what I like to do is just set it in there and then kind of rotate it around so that it's at the bottom. So we've just pushed it in there, and I just rotated it so it's not showing up here. It's already in the groove down there, and we know it's set. Now there's one thing that I forgot about on this. On this bearing, there's a thrust washer on the inside. This is a thrust washer. And there's also one that sits right here. So when the case goes on, this bearing is not flopping in and out. In any case, there we have transmission gears, at least transmission gears are installed. Next, we'll put in, I think we have to put some pieces on for the oil passages. I'll check and make sure we've got all the dowels in place on the engine, like this one in the case. And then we will put a little bit of sealant on here, only in a couple of places. I'll show you where those are. You don't want to put sealant all over this, because you can't put sealant here because you'll fill up these valleys, and these valleys are for oil to run all the way through. I'll provide you kind of a picture of where to put these, and I'm sure I'll be able to put an image up here that you can print out of where to put the sealant. So let's get the other half of the engine case, and let's get these other pieces put in. Then we'll get the other half of the engine case and get the case all put back together. Now that we've got the transmission gears in, we're about ready to put the other half of the case on. We do have a couple of things that have to go in these two holes, and they are just little pieces that look like this. And they are oil squirters. They sit just like this in these oil valleys. You'll see it has a flat piece, and you'll be able to tell by looking in there how these fit in there. Just make sure these are actually in there. I'm going to get the other half of the engine case. We're going to put some sealant in the places where it needs sealant, and we'll put it together. I cleaned this with some brake cleaner. I did the same thing to the top half of the crankcase. So the next thing I did was let it dry just a little while, just to make sure it was completely clean and dry. And we have, as you can see, put the sealant, and this is just black RTV, along the front, not along any of these journals anywhere, along this side in kind of an L or backwards L shape, but not in the areas where the bearings sit anywhere. And then along the back. And it's a very thin layer. There's really not much there at all. But what I'm going to do is let this dry about maybe 5-8 minutes. And then we'll get it put on there. And we'll get the bolts in and get them torqued down correctly. I'll tell you what those bolt sizes are and the torque setting, torque specifications. When we do that, I'll be back after this dries. I've let this black sealant that I put on here dry for about 8 minutes. And you can see it's not gooey anymore. It doesn't come off on your finger, but it's still tacky. So that's what you want. Now I'm going to set this here, and I'm sorry if you see my sock feet or my my really white legs, because I never get any sun. But I'm going to go on the other side. I'm going to go ahead and lay this on the other half of the engine. And I just realized that one of the things I want to do before I do that is I'm going to get some assembly lube. I'm going to pour it all over the crank. I'm going to pour it on these bearings right there. So give me a second. I'm going to do that off camera, and I'll be back to put this other half together. I put some assembly lube on all the parts that I want to. I'm just going to go ahead and move you around to the side. That way you don't have to look at me. You can see this put on there. So give me a second, I'll do that. So I think I've got you set up fairly well. I'm going to just put this other case half on. And it should go on really easily. So you do still want to make sure you've got all the dowel pins. There's one here, and one over here, which is in the other half of the crankcase right now. It can be in either half, but I'll make sure they're both here just to be sure. Okay, so I've got the 3 dowel pins in. And I'm just going to set this on very carefully. Make sure you line it up correctly. It shouldn't take any pressure at all to lay it down on there. And you can see it's met the other half of the crankcase all the way around. If you have to force this on there, there's something wrong. Do not force this on there. It should lay on very easily. So now I've got the case halves together, and we've got to put the bolts in. And if you did like you should have done, you put them in a piece of cardboard so you know exactly where they go. I'm gonna off camera put these in here where they go, and we'll come back and tighten them up. I've got all the bolts just kind of screwed down finger tight. The primary bolts that we need to worry about first are these crankshaft journal bolts here on the inside. And these will get tightened down to 18 foot-pounds. That's not a lot of torque, but we need to do it in 2 steps. So I'm going to go 10 and then 18. I'm going to start with the bolt right here in the middle, these two, and then I'll work my way out. So I'll do here kind of like a zigzag pattern. I know you won't be able to see me tightening the bolts, but I just want you to be able to see the bolts that I am tightening. So I'm going to go ahead and tighten these down to 10 foot-pounds, and I'll come back on camera to do the finish tighten to 18 foot-pounds. So I've done the initial tightening to 10 foot-pounds. I'm going to set my torque wrench to 18 foot-pounds. We're going to go ahead and tighten these again. We're going to go this way, you know, kind of in a inside out order. Alright, we've got them all tightened to spec. I'm going to change sockets and we'll tighten these other ones. These little ones on the front, I believe they get tightened to 18 foot-pounds also, and this one back here, the larger one, will be 29 foot-pounds. So I've tightened all these in here to 18 foot-pounds in 2 steps. I've tightened all these 10mm bolts to 18 foot-pounds. There's one bolt left on the back of the case here, and this one gets tightened to 29 foot-pounds. This is a 14mm. So I'm going to go off camera, I'll get my torque wrench and I will tighten that one up, and then we will put the shift drum in. We've put the crankcase halves together, and we've got the transmission gears in. They're down inside here. The next thing we need to do is put the shift drum in, and the shift drum consists of 5 or 6 parts. I wanted to make sure that everybody understood how the shift drum goes in. One of the primary things you need to make sure of is that they're these shift forks. These are very important in the order and the place in which they go. If you look at these shift drums, each one of them is going to have a marking. Maybe get a little bit better light. So you can see this marking on here. This one says RL. And I'll show you there are 2 of those. So there's another one that says RL. On some transmissions, you'll have a right and a left. And the right and the left correspond to the engine as if it was sitting in the motorcycle correctly. This one's upside down, so right and left are going to be backwards. In any case, these 2 are right-left, which means they're the same. They can go in either spot. I'll show you where they go. There's also one that has a C, and it looks a lot different than the other 2. This one, the C stands for center. So we've got right, left, and center. We're not going to be able to get these forks these shift forks onto these gears where they go with the shift drum in place. So we're going to lay these down in there where they're supposed to go. So I'm just going to take one of these RL shift forks, and these markings always point towards the clutch side of the engine. So make sure when you put these in, the marking points to the clutch side. So this one will go in just like so. And I'm going to go ahead and put this in as the right shift drum. And if you can see right down here, there's a very smooth part of that gear. And if I can get this in there without getting in your way too much, you can see that these shift drums fit right on those smooth sections. And there's another one over here. So I'm going to go ahead and take the other right-left shift drum and set it in place there also. Make sure they shouldn't be hard to put in. They should slide right in without any issues. And they should move smoothly. So these move smoothly. Now I'm going to take the one that says C, this one, so the center shift fork, and I'm going to put it in there so that the C points towards the clutch side of the engine, and this one goes on the other gear. So you want to make sure these kind of sit out of the way, because we're going to be sliding the shift drum in to a hole right here. And then we're going to move these in place and put the rod that these sit on in place. And I'll try to get you set up, but I may have to do this one-handed. I wish I had somebody to help me with the camera. If I have to do this one-handed, it's going to take me a little bit longer, but I'll try to get you set up so that I can do this with two hands and show you how it goes on. I'll be back. I have the shift drum here. So this is what the shift drum looks like. Looks kind of like a ancient hieroglyphic. Maybe. It has a bearing on one side. This bearing is not pressed on. It comes off. Just make sure that you have the bearing seated properly, which I just messed up. So this shift drum is going to slide in from the side. Now if we look down here, there's a hole. We're just going to put the shift drum in that hole. And if you notice, there's a race on the other end that's going to fit into that hole right there. So I'm going to do this off camera because I need two hands to make sure this fits in there, and I'll be back. I have the shift drum in. The race is sitting in there, the small one. The bearing is on this side, and I will show you here. It should be seated most of the way in. So there's a screw that goes here and here, well, here and here, that will hold this bearing in place and also hold this fork rod in place. So let's get that fork rod through there. And as we slide it through there, we've got to pull these shift forks in. And you can see the little pin will sit in each of these grooves. So as we pull the fork rod through there, we've got to get it through the shift fork and make sure that the pin, so here's the fork rod, we'll make sure that the pin sits in there. Now I'm really going to try and get you set up so I can do this, because this is something you probably should be able to see. So I know this is not the best video angle, and I know you can see my white legs. I'm going to go ahead and put, this is the fork shift rod. I'm going to go ahead and start sliding this through, and you'll see it come through here. If you can see it right down here. We need to lift each of these up, and I know my hands are going to get in the way, but you need to make sure that each of these, well, that was unexpected. Let's put that back in place. You need to make sure that each of these slide into that groove. So you can see this pin is going to slide into this groove right here. That one will come forward and slide here. This one will slide into this groove. So we're just going to line it up in a place where all of these grooves are in an open area. Pull it up, and push the rod through. So you can see that that shift pin, I've got the rod through it and it's sitting in the groove. So we'll pull the center fork rod through and do the same thing. Now it is in its own groove. You can see this one I need to lift up a little. Sorry if my hand's in the way. Need to lift this one up a little to get it into the groove. So now it is in its own groove also. And we will push the rod, you'll see it come through here, the rest of the way in. And you may have to wiggle this a little to get it to seat properly into the other side of the engine case. And there we go. So I'm going to turn it back around here. So we've got the shift drum in, and you can see now that all of these shift forks, the rod is going through them and they are all properly engaged onto the shift drum. In fact, we can kind of move the shift drum around a little bit and we can see the shift forks move like so. So when you are pushing or pulling on the shifter, it's moving this shift drum and pushing these gears back and forth. I'm going to now, since we've got that all put together, I'm going to get these screws in place here to hold this in. I'm going to do that off camera. They're just 10mm screws, and I'll come back and tell you what torque they should be. I put the bolts in that hold the bearing down and that hold the pin in place, the shift pin. And these are 10mm bolts, and I tighten them down to right around 20 foot-pounds. They just need to hold everything from going in and out. They don't need to be extremely tight. So let's get moving on with the rest of this. I'm going to flip this over and we'll get some parts put on the top.